Part 8 Peoples and Fatherlands. Aphorism 240. I have heard once again for the first time Richard Wagner's overture to the Minstersinger. It is a magnificent, overladen, heavy, and late art which has the pride to presuppose for its understanding that 2 centuries of music are still living. It is to the credit of the Germans that such a pride was not misplaced. What forces and juices have seasons and zones are not mixed together well. Now it seems archaic, now strange, acid, and too young. It is arbitrary as if it is pompous traditionality. It is not infrequently puckish, still more often rough and uncouth. It has fire and spirit, and at the same time, the loose yellow skin of fruits which ripen too late. It flows broad and full, and suddenly a moment of inexplicable hesitation, as it were a gap between cause and effect, an oppression producing dreams, almost a nightmare. And already the old stream of well-being broadens and widens again. The stream of the most manifold well-being, of happiness old and new, very much including the happiness of the artist and himself, which has no desire to conceal his happiness, astonished knowledge of the masterliness of the means he is here employing, newly acquired, untired artistic means, as his art seems to betray to us. All in all, no beauty, nothing of the south, or of the subtle southerly brightness of sky, something of gratisfaction, no dance, hardly any will to logic, a certain clumsiness, even which is actually emphasized, as if the artist wanted to say, it is intentional. A cumbersome tapestry, something capriciously barbarous and solemn, a flattering of venerable learned lace and conceits. Something German is the best and worst sense of the word, something manifold, formless, inexhaustible in the German fashion, a certain German powerfulness, and overfullness of soul, which is not afraid to hide itself among the refinements of decay, which, perhaps, feels itself most at ease there, a true, genuine token of the German soul, which is at once young and aged, over mellow and still too rich in future. This kind of music best expresses what I consider true of the Germans. They are of the day before tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. Yet they have as if no today to spare themselves. Aphorism 241. We good Europeans, we too have our hours when we permit ourselves a warm-hearted patriotism, a lisp, and regression into old loves and narrowness. I have just given an example of it, hours of national ep- epulation, of, of patriotic palpitation, and floods of various combated old feelings. More ponderous spirits when we may have done well with it, in our own case, is confined to a few hours, and it is then over only after a long period. One takes half a year, another half a life, according to the speed and power with which he digests it and with his metabolism. Indeed, I can imagine dull, sluggish races, which, even in our fast moving Europe, would need half a century to overcome such atavistic attacks of patriotism. And cleaving to one's native soul, and to be restored to reason, I mean to good Europeanism. And, while digressing on this possibility, I chanced to become the ear witness of a conversation between 2 old patriots. It is clear that were both hard of hearing, and thus spoke all the louder. He has, and knows much of philosophy as a peasant, and a fraternity of a student. Said one of them, he is still innocent, but what does that matter nowadays? It is the age of the masses. They fall on their faces before anything massive, and in politics likewise. And statesmen who builds for them another Tower of Babel, some monstrosity of empire and power. They call it great. What does it matter if we, more cautious and reserved than they, persist in the old belief that this is the great idea alone, which can bestow greatness on a deed or a cause? Suppose a statesman were to put his nation in the position of having henceforth to pursue great politics, but which is still ill equipped and badly prepared by nature, so that it had to sacrifice its old and sure virtues for the sake of a new and doubtful mediocrity. Suppose a statesman were to condemn his nation to politic- politicizing at all, while the nation had hitherto had something better to do. And then, think about it, in the depth of his soul, still restrained with cautious disgust for the restlessness, emptiness, and noisy wrangling of those nations which actually do practice politics. Perhaps, though such supposed statesmen were to goad the slumbering passions and desires of his nations, turn its former difference and desire to stand against itself into the stigma, and its predilection for foreign things, and its secret infiniteness into a fault, devalue its most heartfelt inclinations in its own eyes, reverse its conscience, make its mind narrow and its taste national. What? A statesman who did all this, a statesman for whom his nation would have to atone for all future time, assuming it had future, should at once a statesman be great? Undoubtedly, the other patriot replied vehemently. Quote, "And otherwise he would have been able to do it. Perhaps you may say it was mad to want to do such a thing. But perhaps everything great has been merely mad to begin with." End quote. Misuse of words, cried the other. Strong, strong and mad, not great. The old men had obviously grown heated as they thus shouted their truths in one another's faces. I, however, in my happiness and beyond, considered how soon a stronger will become master of the strong. Also, that when one nation becomes spiritually shallower, there is a compensation for it. Another nation becomes deeper. Aphorism 242. Whether that which now distinguishes the European be called civilization, or humanization, or progress, whether one calls it simply without implying any praise or blame, the democratic movement in Europe, behind all the more and political foregrounds indicated by such formulas, a great physiological process is taking place in gathering greater and ever greater impetus. The process of this assimilation of all Europeans, their growing detachment from the conditions under which race dependent on climate and class originate, their increasing independence of any defiant millennium which, through making the same demands for centuries, would like to inscribe itself on soul and body. That is to say, the slow emergence of an essentially supranational and nomadic type of man which, physiologically speaking, possesses as its typical distinction a maximum of the art and power of adaptation. This process of the becoming European, the tempo of which can be retarded by great relapse, but which still wills perhaps precisely through them, gain in vehemence and depth. The still raging storm and stress of national feeling belongs here. Likewise, the anarchism now emerging. The process will probably lead to results which is naive propagators and propagate it. The apostles of modern ideas would be least inclined to anticipate. The same novel conditions which will, on average, create a leveling and and a mediocrity of man, a useful, industrious, highly serviceable, and able herd animal man, are adapted in the highest degree to giving rise to exceptional men of the most dangerous and enticing quality. For while that power of adaptation which continually tries out changing conditions and begins a new labor with every new generation, almost with every decade cannot make possible the powerfulness type. While the total impression produced by such future Europeans will probably be that of the multifarious, garrulous, weak-willed, and highly employable workers who needed a master, a commander, as they need their daily bread, while, therefore, a democratization of Europe will lead to the production of the type prepared for slavery, in the subtlest sense. In individual and exceptional cases, the strong man will be found to turn out stronger and richer than has perhaps ever happened before, thanks to the unprejudiced nature of his schooling, thanks to the tremendous multiplicity of practice, art, and mask. What I mean to say is that the democratization of Europe is at the same time the involuntary arrangement of the breeding of tyrants, in every sense of the word, including the most spiritual. Aphorism 243. I hear with pleasure that our sun is moving rapidly in the direction of the constellation of Heracles, and I hope that men on earth will, in this manner, emulate the sun, and we at their head, we good Europeans. Welcome, everyone, to my channel again, and I've invited a great guest from the land right down under. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, hello. I'm Shane from Zero Input Agriculture is probably my main output on Into the World, both a Substack blog and a podcast. And yeah, I'm an experimental farmer, but I've got much broader interests in culture and history and technology and the future. This was a really great opportunity for me to come and dive into some Nietzsche, who I've been aware of peripherally, but I must confess I haven't read a lot of it in detail before. So thank you for the opportunity, Gregory.
And you're welcome for accepting the opportunity, which, if Nietzsche were in front of us, he'd said, this person is a grand person. He loves danger. Danger was his calling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because you were once unfamiliar and time to be familiarized with this Nietzsche that we've discussed, well, that I've discussed for multiple months, including people that have come and leave on my channel.
Mm.
We
And
first begin. Oh, you go. You continue first.
no, no, I was just going to say how prescient and eerily familiar the sentiments were in the last part of that aphorism, the great flattening of humanity through technology and progress and massification, um, setting the stage for the crazy events of World War II. But there's an eerily similar dynamic happening today with a whole bunch of new technologies that have pushed that social dynamic even further. So yeah, it's very timely to talk about these things.
And with Nietzsche, it first begins with his critique of Richard Wagner. That's the German pronunciation, but in English, it's Richard Wagner.
Mm,
He's primarily critiquing, well, him personally, and the work, say, of the work that he first said, the overture of the Minstersinger von Nuremberg. It's translation of the Master Singer of Nuremberg.
mm,
It's the classical and repetitive opera that's 4.5 hours, excluding the two breaks in between, that people in the orchestra world commonly play. He compliments it as that it's magnificent, overladen, heavy, and late art, and the pride which presupposed the understanding of 2 centuries of music, which are still living today, to the credit of Germans that such a pride was not misplaced. We, what you and I discussed before recording Romanticism and how it impacted Germany. Well, not solely impacted Germany. Germany accepted it. It was it's a lost, wandering child, as I sometimes describe it, like a roaming child, and then this parent adopts it, and comprehends its displeasure of how the democratic enlightenment functioned, where reason and knowledge were the superior forms of thinking, but the body was neglected, including humanity, the instincts, art, and the what the Romantics saw the displeasure and misogyny of women. With Nietzsche, he's classified as the true and last romantic writer because of one, his disagreement with the romantics, but two, is how he saw music affecting society. In this sense, once he became conscious of what Richard Wagner's influence, what he saw as pessimistic Schopenhauerian, Arthur Schopenhauer's a pupil. Well, Nietzsche in his mind is a pupil and a son to his father figure of Schopenhauer, but as we see, he departed from him. He saw the pessimistic and icy temperature of Richard Wagner's music because of how it once advocated of the instincts of society, and now it advocates for the bad conscience or the guilt, the sin, and pitying, or into, or to simply say, advocating latent Christianity on a theatrical scale,
Mm.
which would say that with the forces and juices, with seasons and zones are not mixed together here, it becomes archaic, now strange, acid, and too young. It is an arbitrary as it is pompous traditionality, and it is not infrequently puckish, still more often rough and uncouth. Or, and later he would say it's an oppression producing dreams, almost a nightmare. This inexplicable hesitation that flows and is full of loose yellow skin of fruits that have been ripened too late. But at the same time, it has spirit and fire. What's your
Mm.
initial thoughts?
I see the project of art is often to digest the past and to put it into context. And Romanticism is a really great example of that because it was a reaction to the forces of industrialization spreading through Europe. And it was a way of trying to grab onto some of that pre-industrial past that was being lost and kind of repackage it in a format that could be interpreted by people living in that pretty much industrialized society by that, by the late 1800s. So yeah, that idea that particularly Wagner was a way of orienting between that distant, even pre-Christian past, like he was digging into those kind of pagan myths of Germany and to reforge it into something that could be used in a rapidly changing future. And just to reflect on how that's relevant for today, I'm looking at like YouTube, where there's this constant chopping up of old like TV era media. Like you find little clips of like sitcoms and cartoons and stuff from before the internet age, and then people, talking heads analyzing them, mashups, memes that reference them. It's this process of digestion. We're taking that 20th century body of media that for the older generations it's familiar in memory. For the younger generations that didn't grow up with it, it's just a reference. It's some attempt to orient like where that past generation came from. And it almost feels like it, at least in the digital era, that it's being dissected and digested and repeated to the point where we're going to want to just forget it. Like there's going to be so little of it left. Like we're clearing the stage for something completely different to be created. But because the internet has become so powerful and so ubiquitous so suddenly, there's been this huge backlog of history that has suddenly become accessible to everyone to think about and analyze. But yeah, it's almost like eating a dish to the point where you sicken yourself and you never want to taste it ever again. That's what it feels like we're engaging in collectively.
I agree with you, and not solely on a social media scale, but on a science, political, religious, and music scale. Include what you were discussing, art. So I'll include that art too. It's
Mm,
becoming boring and and passive nihilistic.
Hmm.
While they love labeling and judging in the sense of, oh, this person is this and this person is that, while not questioning themselves from this overwhelming and overfull pride that's suffocating them to digest. Where I was, music is some form of is a variation of art, say with the opera, and I'm a metalhead to heart, and I
Hmm.
love and outside of metal, classical orchestra, the 40s, 50s, and 60s too. But after the 2000s, for me, and sometimes in the 70s, 80s, and 90s of metal, the message that some are delivering is is hesitation, an icy approach, and to to simply say it's not beauty to me. For one example, Black Sabbath's Master Reality album, it was a reaction to how media uh propagated that they were a satanic and occultist band from their first two albums, the self-titled album of Black Sabbath and Paranoid, because of both albums. The second one was anti-war of Vietnam, and the first one was how multiple genres of metal occurred. But the second, but the third album, Master of Reality, was a reaction to how media labeled them, in the sense of how Nietzsche saw Wagner as with his reaction to the instincts or the Voltgeist of the Germanic pagan tribes, the resuscitation in a romantic sense, which I'll say in a second, where later than a second, where Nietzsche disagrees with romanticism. Where I'm arriving at is with Black Sabbath's reaction to media and re-Christianizing themselves for the Master Reality album, Wagner did with re-baptizing or Christianizing his operas and personal philosophical works with suicidal reasoning, as to quote Nietzsche. And to further quote him, all in all, no beauty, nothing of the south, or of the subtle southerly brightness of the sun. And when he uses the symbol of the south or southerly brightness of sun, or of the sky, something overwhelmingly scorching and hot, aka ill-tempered, frustrated.
Did I misinterpret that? I thought I interpreted that part as being that German culture, as it was starting to see itself as a collective through Wagner, it's almost like a cultural schismogenesis against the more Mediterranean classical cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Because like I thought that was kind of a reference to like Roman high culture, and that Germany through that period with Wagner was distinguishing itself as being the opposite of being like dark and brooding and stormy in its aesthetic tone.
And this is a great example of the multifaceted level and scales of Nietzsche, where people have this interpretation, and then they hear this one that I said before you. They're like,
Mm.
oh, so that brings out more light and clarity of what he's saying. Now remember, this is my interpretation that I have
Yeah,
developed through my time. You can have your interpretation, but if you're
yeah,
curious, I can say mine, and we can have a middle ground, including the people that I've invited to my channel too, where
yeah, yeah.
including the uneducated, in the sense of uneducated of Nietzsche.
And that's me. That's me. So I'm more likely to be missing the mark on things. I did have one interesting thought though.
Yeah.
I grew up in the classical music world, like played in orchestras and all that kind of stuff. And around Wagner's time was kind of like the swan song of that high art as like a popular medium. And classical music tried to transform through like the early 20th century, and it just became weird. And it lost its audiences who went off to like popular music and became the foundation for like the mass pop music era, like leading probably right up to the 90s, I would say. But
Hmm.
it feels like we're going through a similar process that pop music as a mass art form it's starting to drift into irrelevancy. It's split into so many little kind of subgenres on one spectrum that almost nobody knows and can find, and the stuff that is consumed for a mass audience is so bland and boring, and it's kind of already a museum piece. Like it doesn't really have any vitality left in it anymore. It makes me wonder if there's a parallel there with like the death of like opera and classic music in the 19th century when it reached its kind of peak and then faded away. Has something similar happened to pop music as a mass cultural phenomenon in our age, and we didn't even kind of notice it happening?
Hmm. And this is where Nietzsche answers your question
Hmm.
or your concern. Hear this closely. It's nothing of gracefulness, no dance, hardly any will to logic, a certain clumsiness, even which is actually emphasized, as if the artist wanted to say, quote, it is intentional, a cumbersome or heavy drapery, something capriciously barbarous and solemn, meaning serious, a flattering of venerable learned lace and conceits, something German in the best and worst sense of the word, something multiple, formless, inexhaustible in the German fashion, a certain German powerfulness, an overfullness of soul which is not afraid to hide itself among the refinements of decay, which perhaps feels itself most at ease there, a true, genuine token of the German soul which is at once young and aged, over mellow and still too rich in the future.
See, I took that to mean kind of Wagner's role in the formation of the new national German identity, that they distinguished themselves from like other examples of great unified
Hmm.
cultures like Rome. And I suspect as well, like Britain was kind of the preeminent power at that time, but Germany was newly forming in a more vital way that I could see how they considered themselves as a potential rival to Britain, which was this older, more established, and already starting to like structurally decay. Even though it was still very large, but I think Germany saw itself as more dynamic at that
Yeah.
time in history, and that led up to it challenging Britain's position through World War One and World War Two. That it felt like it was the up and coming player on the world stage, but it needed to define itself culturally in some distinctive way so that they could feel unified in their difference.
And it showed the power relations of belittling one another in news media, which
Hmm.
is which is another form of corruption, of wounding and torturing with a word. If it's well said, it's well believed, and
Mm.
it's another method of murdering somebody, but not physically, but psychologically and mentally, and to the, and it involves a physiological or physical acceptance of it that becomes ingrained in one's mind, which shows that when you were saying of Great Britain or the United Kingdom and Germany, it showed a form of joy relation of the old and the new chessmates in this game of chess.
Mm.
And if you in the early 1800s, if you involve uh at that time, which was the fresh but pompous traditionalist Napoleon de Bonaparte in France,
Hmm.
how he
Hmm.
became this fresh and pompous person, and the others were having their joy in the old classical style, which was still the rivaling and slowly decaying enlightenment, democratic enlightenment to say.
I think that's what's really different between Nietzsche's time and our time, that we are pretty much already possibly at the peak of unification of culture and society across the planet. I know we kind of we do little puppet shows of rivalry, but when you
Yeah.
look beneath the surface, they're nothing like the rivalries of the 19th century. The the idea that like China and the US would genuinely go to war, they are so interwoven with each other economically that neither one can afford to like properly attack the other. it doesn't actually make sense. But I mean, for political purposes, it's fun and it's useful to, shake your saber at those people over there. But that's mostly for like domestic consumption. The actual reality of the capacity to do that, I don't think it's really there in the way that it was in like Nietzsche's time. And I think a lot of people have noticed this in his writing. It was very prescient
Yep.
about the potential for these conflicts that were coming in coming decades after he did most of his writing.
Hmm. And this ties with his concern of how music was participating on a social scale.
Hmm.
With his what he would say will to logic, this clumsy, cumbersome, barbarous, solemn, manifold but formless and inexhaustible fashion. If we take away the German part where he's saying of German this, German that, and applied it to modernity, how it has this powerful and overflowing fullness of the soul becomes a refinement of decay. He says in the final sentence, and this is where I'll elaborate his denial of romanticism. He said, quote, "This kind of music best expresses what I consider true of the Germans. They are of the day before yesterday and the day after tomorrow. They have as yet no today."
Mm.
Wh- which is which is an expression of distress and weariness and an inability to flourish in the present conditions
Mm.
of that present time.
Mm.
Where he This is where he criticizes the romantics, and as we said, the Germans absorbed romanticism, similar how they absorbed the Industrial Revolution with their fondness of steel,
Hmm.
similar to a caveman of discovering fire. Ooh, steel! I want this. And that's where he criticizes romanticism, specifically German romanticism, of that they desire to imitate and reverse time to the aristocratic systems and values. In the use of modern term, it's a LARP or an imitation and flattery.
Yeah.
That's where that final statement of they have as yet no today because they prefer something of yesterday and how to reform it tomorrow, but not stabilizing in the present moment. Didn't the Eastern philosophers or the Eastern philosophy preach of that, of the present now?
Um, yes, I mean that was kind of they had the opposite ideal. It was giving up connection to the past and the future was their recipe for like actual success, and the Germans seem to have embraced the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting too. I like the idea of art and culture being like it's like a compensatory mechanism for reality. So, for example, if your world is really peaceful, then your art will feature a lot of violence and fear because
Mm-hmm.
people have they have a set of psychological needs that need to be fed to varying degrees. So, if you've only got potatoes on your plate, you'll take a vitamin pill that has what the meat had in it. That's the art that kind of substitutes for what's missing in your diet. And um, I see like a lot of the romantic movement was a reaction to modernity, that people's lives
Yeah.
were becoming dull and lifeless and mechanical and polluted and lacking in a degree of freedom that they imagined that the serfs used to have, a degree of independence, even though, and I mean, it's funny, we've flipped it around today that we view medieval serfs as being slaves, but they weren't. They had so much agency and independence that we can't even imagine anymore. Our stories won't allow us to believe it because we have to use culture to tell ourselves how free we are now. And we're not. If you really look closely, we're the most managed and herded and manipulated people that have ever been on the face of the planet. And I think during Nietzsche's time, the population was more conscious of that transformation, whereas our generation grew up in that state, and it was a bit easier for us to just assume that was normal.
Similar with the warmongering tendencies of Nietzsche's time.
Mm.
Nietzsche himself enlisted in uh, the the German army, as I said before recording, as a medical aid.
Mm.
and his overly prideful joy for the German unification, which beautifully transitions to 241. And this one's
Hmm.
quick. It's long, but because of two people discussing, as he would say, two stubborn but patriotic people on how to govern their native soil. But the first part, where he discusses the good Europeans, we have to our hours when we are permitted ourselves as warm-hearted patriotism, a lisp, and regression into old loves and narrowness. I have just given an example of it. aka the example was of music of the previous aphorism. The hours of our embellishing, and not embellishment but embellishing, of patriotic palpitation and floods of various outmoded feelings, aka this collect this collective movement on a now European and patriotic scale is where this regressive ideology of that old love of the old systems and the narrowness of their minds of not relinquishing that traditionalism for something progressive, because in their mind their form of progressivism or progression is stability and an unchanging future. And this includes with the patriotic yeah, the patriotic propaganda to elicit the feelings or the emotions of you serve for your country, we'll give you this. If you don't serve your country, you can leave.
Mm.
Similar to how a criminal commits crime, they're committing inside their um they're committing a crime inside their nation, but they're imprisoned and sometimes deported. So if you disobeyed something that's patriotic, you become unpatriotic and amoral in the eyes of the nation. And
Hmm.
this is where he says this is where not what he says, but this is where he observes that romanticism became a political concern. There's a person by the name of have I said this to you before? Peter Sloterdijk, where he
Yes.
where
Yeah.
he he says that language is naturally concerns and evolve itself in the present as it is and through monumental history, because its first mode of speech is self-glorification, or its
Mm.
second mode of speech is the state of affairs. And that's where and the first mode of speech, as he describes it, as the national and mutual um, vibration of a nation, aka
Mm.
shaken at its core. And this is where Nietzsche would discuss this patriotism as self glorification, and where the state's affairs, it becomes second of how, say, for example, the 1848 revolutions to unify under one banner.
Mm.
This is where Nietzsche would emit, well, if it was Nietzsche in the Prussian army, he would agree. But in the 1880s, the matured mind Nietzsche, including the time of him writing Beyond Good and Evil, he would severely disagree, both of
Mm.
himself at that time and how it evolved after the French, well, before and after the French Revolution. Your
As I
thought?
was saying before, this is. Oh, sorry, I interrupted.
No, I was saying your thoughts.
Oh, yes, sir. As we were saying a bit before we started recording, I'm really intrigued by how um, communication technology and culture advances to allow larger groups of people to coordinate together. And you see this through the Industrial Revolution of this patchwork of small political entities gradually merging and merging and merging into larger and larger structures. Particularly when it gets easier to send communication around to coordinate on a practical level, and also to send culture between all of those groups of people so that they develop a common spirit that you can actually make them all march in the same direction when you need to.
Yeah,
Um, but when you do that, even though the technology is becoming more sophisticated, often the culture has to become simpler in order to be more transmissible between all of those different people. And again, I think this is something we see today in our digital um, information environment, that culture is being boiled down to like its most basic ingredients. Like a viral meme or a viral tweet has almost no like information content left in it. It's like a virus that's been stripped down to like the three genes that it needs to jump on to the next host, and everything else has been like stripped out. So there's been this weird impoverishment of mass culture, but at the same time, it has a global reach. Like if you put together just the right combination of, pixels or words, your idea can spread within like days to billions of people,
Yeah.
but it can't actually do very much because all the only thing it's selected for is transmissibility. And yeah, I think we're in a really weird state. It's like a planet scale blob of culture that the only thing it really does is unify, but it's like it's ship that's so big that you can't actually steer it anymore.
Yes. And this is the point where individuals will say, "Oh, this is bad. We want to go beyond this bad." But at the same time, we have to live in this bad before it becomes an evil. And do we want to be
Mm,
stay in this evil? No, I want to go away from this evil. Nietzsche would respond to these individuals saying, "Well, social media, if if somebody resurrected Nietzsche in modernity, oh my, the work he would produce in this age." I think there would be a handful of individuals, including myself, would read what he would say, and depending on depending on his temper that day and whomever provoked his sensitive mind and body, he would say that social media, the pandemic, the climate of anxiety, and the algorithmic style of what life is now, those were the test to our abilities to foster higher values. But because of the ambiguous, clouded, and resentmentful reactive emotions, those are the first and foremost um, primary class, which were once secondary, but now are the first class of how society functions. And that
mm.
now that the first class that was of creative actions or instincts are now secondary, which there's a word that he highlights in the second part of 241 is politicalizing.
Mm. Yeah, we're forcing these masses to be involved in the political process, but they can only do it in a really shallow way.
Yeah,
They're not actually. I don't know how to put this. Nietzsche put it so well. But yeah, I don't know. I guess he's contrasting it to the prior order where politics was done by a very small subset of humanity, and most people just got on with their everyday life and preferred it that way. Like the democracy, mass democracy, we present it as this kind of liberation. But it's interesting that surveys of young people today in the West, so many of them say they don't think democracy works. The scale at which it's operating is basically just propaganda and psyops to like nudge a few percent of people one way or another. The self-directedness of the individual driving that process doesn't really function anymore like our myths try to tell us it does.
and from this pace and power, it's sometimes difficult for a man and a woman too, but it's difficult for individuals to digest due to their metabolism and how they lack this ad, adapt adaptiveness to how the pace and power of society moves,
Mm,
including what you were both describing now as what he air quotes is good Europeans that have what the collective conscience and common sense of good conscience, which Nietzsche would see and say as bad conscience, okay, the sinner, the sinful individual who's guilty. Oh, there was two things in my head, but it left nonetheless. Um,
I don't know if I'm jumping ahead too much, but I think the answer is in one of the next sections where he talks about um, the potential for individuals to break out of that mass. That it's, and you could almost look at this as a positive that here's a good analogy. Like the bigger the chorus, the more
yeah.
spectacular the soloist has to be to stand out from them. And
Yes. What you're describing is the the final sentence of this aphorism, the next one
mm,
and the final one.
mm,
The the last sentence, as he would say, the old men have obviously grown heated as they thus shouted their truth in one another's face. I, however, in my happiness and beyond, consider how soon a stronger will become master of something stronger. And also
mm,
that when one nation becomes spiritually shallower, there is a compensation for it. Another nation becomes deeper.
mm.
This
It,
is how, and this is how relevant we'll be what watching the Kingdom of Heaven as our assignment in
mhm.
our community and in our personal community. But that once you watch the movie and see the two dynamic religions and regions competing one another for the Holy Land of Jerusalem, that is what he's uh, saying here as the one nation becomes spiritually shallower, and their compensation is that another nation becomes deeper, aka stronger, and the master of this strength. And he continues forward that the Europeans we call civilized and humanized or progressed are simply, without implying any praise or blame, the democratic movement in Europe. Where Nietzsche is criticizing democracy is how it advocates, or in this sense, has this blind faith of equality and leveling everybody to a civilized and good conscience human level, aka how he criticizes the utilitarians of England and France. If you're familiar with utilitarianism, it's a
Mm.
form of Christianity that uses who was the person who was the naturalist before Charles Darwin? Um, Lam- Lamarck,
Lamarck? Yeah, Lamarck.
Lamarck, and
Yeah.
how he has this this pre-natural selection theory of what is practically useful versus what is impractically dreadful for
Mm,
progress of a species, and now they incorporate that on a Christian level, which he saw as latency or in a form of being but static.
mm. An
Um,
interesting related point here might be that the origin of that collective democratizing spirit in practice, you could highlight the Prussian model for modern schooling. That if you wanted citizens in a democracy, you needed to create their minds through a centrally managed structure like a school. That formerly peasant parents had their children like torn away from them under protest to be put into these institutions to have their minds reformed so that they were compatible with mass democracy and industrialization. And that's the model that spread everywhere in the West. If you went to school, in a public school or a private school, you were subjected to this Prussian system of behavioral modification for children.
yeah, the it's the process of assimilation and how they adapt it to a machine and senseless form of society.
Mm.
And he would
The
say in
the
yeah,
interchangeability of the people in the society was the key thing. That you could, in theory, take anyone from one village and drop them in another one, and they'd work in the factory, and they'd be productive, and they'd vote, and everything would go smoothly. But something was lost in that transition.
it's similar to a stock and trade situation where we buy the student and now we sell them to the factory, and now the factory buys them for this intermediate phase of wages, and now they're fired and now they're sold to another stock owner, etc., etc.
Hmm.
This is he would say, I know that this work is irrelevant, but what the context of what he's saying in another work is relevant to now. Um, in the genealogy of morals, essay 2, aphorism 12, he said that this is lacking a theory of willpower, that these democratic idiosyncratic people have a desire and wish to rule, but they lack that desire to rule.
Yeah, that's the thing about power. Like it's either, I mean, it's almost like a zero sum situation. You can either have perfect egalitarianism where the power is distributed, or
Hmm.
but if you want coordination, then you have to give up some of that power to the overarching structure. And
Yeah.
ironically, the further you go into that process, the more you become just a cog in the machine, the more you need culture and art to convince you that you are actually free. And I think we see that in like particularly 20th century media and culture. It's all of these fantasies of like, underdogs bucking the system and independence, and it's our mythology that we are embedded in because it prevents us from confronting the reality that there's almost nothing that we can do on our own anymore without the machine's blessing.
Hmm. And I see this as administrative nihilism, where the
Hmm.
process of collecting this mass number of people to where they have this fostering and growing detachment of of independence and self cultivation,
Mm.
where they're licensed under the condition of dependency on culture and class to thrive, and that what they're granted is this fake independency where it's a defiant feature of life.
Mm.
And to quote him here, through making the same demands for centuries would like to inscribe itself on body and soul. That is to say, the slow emergence of the essentially supranational and nomadic type of man, which, physiologically speaking, possesses as its typical distinction at maximum of the art and power of adaptation. Adaptation in this sense is where the democratic means and its means to an end, aka the state, is, how can I say this? Is where it lacks the sense of self power or self
Mm.
willpower for second class reactivity, aka their form of action, which is fundamentally reaction, and it causes the stimuli of pleasure from judgment and perspective. There's a in Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols and the Four Great Errors. He has a criticism to conservatives too. Now we've discussed the liberal part. The conservative part is where he says all these conservatives, they see vice and luxury as symptoms to preserve and to uh, slow down the process of a thriving culture.
Mm.
And this is his that's his criticism where he re- refutes them is this, where the symptoms of luxury and vice come into play. They they do preserve the instincts, but it becomes a decline of instinct. And once those instincts decline, culture declines
Mm.
from the lack of sense of how power
Yeah.
is exploitive, encroaching, and how it dominates and wishes to dominate one another, both on a natural and universe scale too, which
I,
shows Nietzsche's will to power, that it's not an independent unit.
yeah. I had an interesting thought. This idea about progress and massification of society comes from maintaining the adaptability of the humans within it. And I wonder if that's tied into infantilization or neoteny, that
Hmm.
modern culture keeps individuals in a childlike mind state, because children are much more flexible and easy to induce to do what you want them to do. They have less of that internalized force of will. Depending on the stage of development you're talking about, like very
Yeah.
early toddlers could be quite unmanageable with that aspect. But when you get to like middle childhood, and I wonder if that's actually how the modern cultural schooling system is designed to work, that it keeps us in that kind of dependent childlike mindset that we always just automatically look to an authority to tell us how we're supposed to act and respond, and that we maintain that flexibility. If we have to stop working in factory A and go to war or become, skilled in factory B, we have
Yeah.
that endless ability to just keep reinventing ourselves as the system demands, and those demands change.
That's a great perspective. One that I was thinking, well, one that I was one formulating while you're saying that is similar on the child scale, and Nietzsche has a different perspective of the child, where they're a yes sayer to life, aka a life affirmer.
Mm,
They're innocent, forgetting, creative, curious, and experimental. While the
mm,
child you're describing is, say, for example, socialism and anarchism, that they're dependent on the state. The that the resources of what they see as bad or evil, they don't recognize it as to flourish their good because they're concentrated on disassembling, or as he would say, the same novel conditions, which will, on average, create leveling and mediocrity of man, a useful, industrious, highly serviceable, and able herd animal man are adapted in the highest degree, and to give rise to exceptional men of the most dangerous and enticing quality. AKA, once a man is belittled in society or is unused, unfamiliar, and frowned on, it leaves the role of masculinity to who? Women attempt it, and it still blunders.
mm,
That is similar to how, as he would say, exceptional men, but it doesn't leave space for higher men or a higher type of taste. It's where people imitate the majority man and not the higher man. Same with the genders, how they imitate one another. Now
mm,
it's on a physical scale. Um, that is how he would see this raging, still raging storm and stress of national feeling, where it provoked anarchism and socialism to be present on the geopolitical scale. This
mm,
exigency of reform and progress is a civilizing an instrument of civilization where no man is fearing other men. And this is an irrelevant person, but to say Kierkegaard, or the English pronunciation of Kierkegaard, he would
mm.
say that is the the finite despair, both finite and infinite despair. Which, once we arrive at the Kierkegaard series, I'll elaborate on both of them. What's your
I mean,
thoughts?
it holds together if you add in the ingredient that the machine, the superstructure of this society, simultaneously constantly reinforces a set of fears. Because like scared children are like the easiest kind of psychology to manipulate if you do it carefully, particularly if at the same time you're constantly reassuring them by saying, oh no, I have the remedy to that fear right here. So you keep them between those two poles. You've got the carrot and the stick in multiple dimensions, keeping them psychologically limited to what they think is possible. And keep and I mean humans are, I don't know, like I'm a big believer in ideas like Dunbar's number, that there's scales of social complexity that we are very good at doing. But then when you go beyond those scales, and that's pretty much what the last 200 years have been about. It's been an experiment in building bigger and bigger and bigger social organizations. The only way you can do that is to take these very complex individual creatures and sand all of the rough edges off them, and kind of defang them so that you can put them all in a cage together and they don't tear each other apart. Like that's the ironic thing. Like when you first start becoming aware of this kind of way of looking at the world, your first reaction is to like look at the machine above you and think, "Oh, that's really scary now. I understand that's a threat."
Yeah.
But the next step is to look around you and realize there's this mass of very tightly controlled people who are all like time bombs waiting to go off. Like human beings are like praying mantises or lions or something. We're very capable of hurting and killing each other when the mood takes us. And if you look in like more primitive, simpler societies, that kind of interpersonal violence is just constantly going on in the background. Like the rate at which people just casually murder each other is off the charts. And so like the system we have collectively created has figured out how to divert those instincts, those capabilities, so it's possible to pack a million of us in a little cage. And that structure can achieve all sorts of amazing things, but it comes at a price. And I think those instincts never completely go away. So for the
Hmm.
individual in that system, there's always a feeling of mismatch. But I mean, I think this is evolution all over. Like the first fish that climbed out onto the mud and started breathing, that wasn't a pleasant process for them. Like the first time they were
No, it
trying to do
wasn't.
it with these half evolved lungs, it would have been horrible. Like they were testing the limits of what their individual capabilities could do. And I think we're doing that as humans as well. We're experimenting with how we can come together on scales that were, just thousands of years ago were unimaginable that you could have, like China with a billion odd people nominally under one political system. Um, it's just astonishing. And I mean, even that is only like 100 years old. And before that, it was, a tenth as many people, a tenth as much complexity, a tenth as much potential conflict.
Yes, and that defying and form of, say, natural corollary of becoming, it too becomes an involuntary uh, orientation to breed tyrants.
Mm,
In the sense of how power relations adapt to one another. Herbert Spencer, who's a precursor to Darwin, he's the one that said survival of the fittest. People associate that with Darwin. Survival of the fittest in this sense of Herbert Spencer, he's saying self-preservation, where Darwin disagrees with self-preservation. But the definition I'm saying now is internal how people internally adapt to external circumstances. He's Nietzsche would say the same thing with the power of adaptation, where this flux of conditions begin with new labor with every new generation and almost with every new decade, but at the same time it can't control nor stabilize the powerfulness to produce, as to quote him, to produce by such future Europeans or now modern men, probably be that of a multifaceted, talkative, weak-willed, and highly employable workers who need a master, a
mm,
commander, as if
mm,
as if they need their daily bread. That sarcasm at the end, their daily bread, is how Christianized the machine has become, to
mm,
say. Where
mm.
you were
Yeah,
saying where people are scared of the machine, why do they point at the sky? Because it's their tendency to point at God. And
yeah,
now
yeah.
that God, in a spiritual and malicious sense, has become a now physical malicious object. Once metaphysical, it now creates a metaphysical and physical tyrant. Um,
Well,
this
think about
entire
it today
time,
with the internet and like mass surveillance. We
yeah,
haven't all seen God looking over our shoulder, seeing if we're sinning. Like that's no longer just a like metaphysical or supernatural concept. It's
yeah.
actually real now. Our overlords can literally hear and see everything that we do for all intents and purposes.
What's hysterical is that the entire time we were speaking, I was thinking of the Pink Floyd song "Welcome to the Machine." from
Mm-hmm.
their "Wish You Were
Mm-hmm.
Here" album. It's the middle track before the track of "Have a Cigar," and then the final track of six part 6 through 9 of uh, "Shine On You Dancing Star." I think is the final track. But
Mm-hmm.
David Gilmour, he 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 tarnished his vocals in that track, and he said, "Son, welcome to the machine. Beat it now, or be left behind."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Well, it makes me wonder, like the idea of the Matrix, like that's kind of the more well, slightly more recent idea of that concept. Why couldn't the Matrix have worked with all of the people in those pods actually knowing that they were people in the pods and they were making that decision, and the alternative was to like go and stumble around the wasteland?
yeah,
Like, why did they
um,
have to be deceived? And I think when those kind of structures first evolve, they're working with a raw material that's adapted for different circumstances, and it doesn't necessarily easily fit into the new arrangement. But humans are very adaptable, and we can like tweak our various instincts to, varying degrees at various costs. And maybe, give it another million years and the Matrix would be full of voluntary humans who are like, yeah, I'm quite happy living in this fantasy land, and you can use my brain to, do graphics processing when I'm asleep. That's a fair trade-off. um and maybe it's the same with our societies. If we stay in these like technological mass societies, maybe the masses will eventually reach the point where they can understand the deal and accept it and not reactively just blow everything up. Maybe we're kind of already at that point. Maybe that's part of the nihilism of today's age is coming to terms with that on a more conscious level.
mhm. Well, it conscious in the sense of how you're conscious of the utility of technology. Others have this unconscious virtue, and they redirect their energy. Well, no, they unconsciously direct their power or energy to defending and rationalizing the use of it. That shows a lack of joy and a increase or maximum of despair of the present conditions.
Mm, mm,
Similar to what we were saying earlier of the Romantics, where they were unpleased with the present conditions, so they prefer. And same with the Christians, their good in life is either death or an afterlife. Is
mm.
how they receive their good. Um, and while Christianity is relevant, they denounce that the physical body and mind are are secondary, and that a non-physical virtue in reality, because they perceive people as walking and roaming souls.
I
Which
love what. Oh, sorry. I'm always interrupting. No, continue. Continue.
I do this too to you, but which shows that the democratization of of modernity, and Nietzsche would say Europe, showed a guidance to producing a prepared form of slavery. In this
Mm,
sense, the individual, the individual and higher strong, the air quote strong man, and how the common see a strong man in their eyes or redefine a strong man is, to quote him. Now that I see it here, to quote him, to turn out stronger and richer than has perhaps ever happened before, thanks to the unprejudiced nature of his schooling, thanks to the tremendous multiplicity of practice, art, and a crucial word, mask. What I mean to say is that the democratization of Europe is at the same time an involuntary arrangement for the breeding of tyrants, in every sense of the word, including the most spiritual. Spiritual in this sense of control and manipulation.
mm, mm.
And to finalize this episode with this aphorism, this is what Nietzsche sees as pleasurable. That our sun rapid moving rapidly in the direction of the constellation of Heracles, or in the English pronunciation, Hercules. I use the Greek pronunciation every time because to me
Mm,
it sounds sophisticated or austere,
mm,
but uh, and I hope that men on the earth will in this manner emulate the sun, and we at their head, and no air quotes, and we at their head, we good Europeans, end quotes. Why he doesn't include air quotes there in a ironic and sarcastic sense is because he has this envisage or futuristic vision of the extra moral age,
hmm
where man is conscious, self-reflective, affirming, becoming, while at the same time realizing that if they can't produce a sense or a feeling, don't frown upon of not producing that naturally, which shows the indifferent universe of wills, as he would say, energy that produce a physiological excellence and
mm,
greatness.
mm.
Your final thoughts?
Um, so in this case, the allusion to Heracles is that having a degree of godlike virtue and strength. I would imagine that's what it's alluding to. Am,
As a
am I yeah? Am I correct in that interpretation? That's what the implication is there.
as not as not solely a godlike, but as a classicus value, as a
Hmm
adaptive tool and not an abstract ideal, which the Romantics thought as an abstract ideal. It's not,
mm,
but a value for to culturally alter to culturally alter society with the present conditions.
yeah,
say
yeah, yeah, yeah,
say for example his overman or ubermensch, it's not, it's a symbol but a value for culture on a
yeah,
both individual and collective scale.
yeah, yeah,
It's not a hero nor savior to redeem individuals from their lives. That implies Jesus Christ,
yeah.
and that's where
It's a state to which we can all aspire, but the Europeans seem to be particularly important in leading that charge.
and it's not a collective challenge, well, not the collective, but a cognitive challenge to establish value. But
Mm,
it's similar to a proto Darwinian view
mm,
of materialism, of how the material conditions. This is how, again, he refutes romanticism, where they rationally establish culture, structure, and morals with reason and knowledge, but they never realize that the ancient world, which is extinct and can't be resurrected, they structured their lives through material, social, and cultural conditions of their time, which is
mm, mm.
drastically different of the 1800s, where the second industrial revolution was appearing, the 1848 revolutions appearing on the global scale, and and two, with the Heracles example, an opportunity to use and overcome nihilism
Mm, mm.
for higher functionaries and values.
I have
And
one final thought that I want to bring in, and
yeah,
it's tangentially related, but it's got me. It ties back to this catalytic role that Wagner's operas played in forging the German spirit and propelling them into the future. I've read an amazing study recently, a theory of the origin of music and its importance in human evolution. And the theory is that a really key stage in our evolution, bands of our ancestral hominins came together for a coordinated threat display. So they'd all be singing and dancing and moving in a particular way that made them seem like one huge dangerous organism. And with that power, they could approach a pack of lions that had just brought down a large prey animal and drive them off the prey through this kind of display. And the really interesting little detail in this, um, this is probably where the ability for shared song and dance to lead to depersonalization, that your identity is dissolved and becomes part of the group through that shared movement and sound. And the reason why that's really important is it allows individuals to potentially put themselves in danger and sacrifice themselves as the whole group performs this dangerous task together. And for me, that is just the perfect echo of what Wagner's operas were just part of for that German spirit, that coming together, that corps d'esprit, I think it is in French, the feeling when a group of soldiers who know each other all charge into battle, knowing that some of them are going to die for each other and for their people. And you can almost look at all music and dance and culture and language as a kind of collective display that we are all to some degree lost in, that where our individual identity, even though that's an important part of the balance and the superstructure, it's never an absolute thing. It's always emergent from the whole and always in danger of dissolving into the whole in varying ways.
There's two Nietzsche quotes on music. One is, if music didn't exist, life would be a mistake. The other quote is, those seen dancing were thought insane for those who'd never heard the music.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Apply those two quotes, and now the latter and late part of the video, but apply those two quotes to what you're saying and what Nietzsche's addressing, and how music both ignites, and similar to filming and cinema, but how
Mm.
music ignites the atavistic, or the reversal, or not the reversal, but the primitive instinct of the pre-moral era, similar to the Spartans and the Peloponnesian War. Appreciate you, Shane, for accepting the invitation and the opportunity
Yes.
to walk with Nietzsche with me.
Yes. Yeah, I loved it. I loved it. If you ever want to have me back, if you find a section you think I'd really get into, I'd love to do it again.
Yes, sir. And remember, everyone, amor fati, love your fate.